The fluorescent lights of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport hummed a tune of endless transit, a sound 17-year-old Zoe Wilson usually loved. It was the music of possibility. Today, it was the soundtrack to her future, a prestigious summer arts program in Florence. She clutched her first-class ticket, a graduation gift from her father, feeling the crisp edges of the paper that represented her dreams. But at gate F7, under the scrutinizing gaze of a gate agent named Brenda, that dream was about to collide with a nightmare. In a moment of bitter judgment, a single piece of paper would be torn, setting off a chain reaction that would expose the dark underbelly of power, prejudice, and the hidden fractures within a family, shaking the very foundations of the world's busiest airport. The air in the International Terminal F at Hartsfield-Jackson was a familiar cocktail of jet fuel Cinnabon and low-grade anxiety. For Zoe Wilson, it was the smell of home. Not the suburban Atlanta home, with its sprawling oak tree and tire swing, but the home of her father's world. Jack Wilson was the executive director of Hartsfield-Jackson, a title that sounded impossibly grand, but to Zoe just meant he was the man who made sure the river of humanity flowed smoothly through this massive concrete and glass delta. Today, however, the airport wasn't about her dad. It was about her. Zoe adjusted the strap of her Telfar bag on her shoulder, the rich oxblood color a stark contrast to her simple white t-shirt and distressed jeans. Tucked inside was her sketchbook, its pages filled with charcoal studies of faces' hands and the intricate play of light on mundane objects. Her destination, Florence, Italy. The Accademia di Belle Arti had accepted her into their exclusive summer intensive program for promising young artists. It was the culmination of every art class, every late night spent practicing cross-hatching, every ounce of her creative soul poured onto paper. Her father had surprised her with the first-class ticket on Delta. "For my first-class artist," he'd said, his voice thick with a pride that always made Zoe feel both buoyed and burdened. He wanted the world for her, and he had the means to provide a piece of it, but she was fiercely determined to earn her own way. Still, the comfort of seat 2B for a 9-hour flight was a gift she wasn't foolish enough to refuse. She approached the boarding queue for flight DL192 to Rome, the first leg of her journey. The line was a chaotic mix of excited tourists, weary business travelers, and families wrangling overtired children. The gate area was presided over by 2 Delta agents. One was a young man with a kind if stressed smile, efficiently scanning passports and wishing passengers a pleasant flight. The other was a woman who looked as if she had personally absorbed all the ambient stress in the terminal. Her name tag read Brenda. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face set in a permanent mask of weary disapproval. Her eyes, sharp and quick, scanned the passengers not with customer service in mind, but with the cynical gaze of a prison guard looking for contraband. Zoe watched her for a moment. She saw the way Brenda's shoulders tensed when a large, boisterous family struggled with their carry-ons, the slight curl of her lip as she spoke curtly to an elderly man who didn't understand her instructions. An artist's eye for detail. Zoe noted the fraying on the cuff of Brenda's uniform and the deep-set lines of fatigue around her eyes. She felt a brief, fleeting pang of sympathy. This was a tough job. When it was her turn, she found herself in Brenda's line. "Passport and boarding pass." Brenda said, her voice flat, not bothering to make eye contact. "Hi, how are you?" Zoe offered with a small, polite smile, sliding her passport and the crisp printout across the counter. Brenda's eyes flicked up, taking in Zoe's appearance. The designer bag, the meticulously cared-for braids cascading over her shoulders, the youthful confidence. Zoe saw a flicker of something in the woman's eyes. Annoyance. Disbelief. It was a look she'd seen before, the silent questioning of her presence in a space where some people believed she didn't belong. Brenda picked up the boarding pass. Her eyes narrowed on the words, "First class." She then looked back at Zoe, her gaze lingering judgmental. "This ticket is for Zoe Wilson," Brenda stated, her tone accusatory. "That's me," Zoe replied, her smile tightening slightly. The sympathy she'd felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by a familiar cold prickle of caution. Brenda looked from the passport photo back to Zoe's face, her scrutiny intense. "This doesn't look like you." Zoe's brow furrowed. "It's a passport photo. They're never very good. But it's me." Brenda tapped a long acrylic nail on the counter. "Where did you get this ticket?" The question was so laden with insinuation that it struck Zoe like a physical blow. It wasn't a standard security question. It was an accusation. "It was a gift," Zoe said, her voice losing its warmth, becoming as flat as the agent's. "A gift," Brenda repeated, drawing the words out with a saccharine disbelief. "A first-class ticket to Rome is a very generous gift. Who gave it to you?" "My father." Zoe clipped out the injustice of the interrogation, making her cheeks burn. She could feel the eyes of the people behind her in line. She saw a man in a business suit shift uncomfortably. "And what does your father do that he can afford to just give away tickets like this?" Brenda pressed her voice, dripping with a corrosive mix of envy and suspicion. This was it. The line. Zoe was a private person. Her father's job was his, not hers. She never flaunted it, never used it. But now she was being profiled and cross-examined as if she were a criminal. "He works," Zoe said, her voice low and tight. "I don't see how that's relevant to you scanning my boarding pass." Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "It's relevant because these tickets are often acquired fraudulently. Young people using stolen credit cards, thinking they can just waltz into first class." She held up the boarding pass between her thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. "And you fit the profile?" "Fit the profile?" Zoe repeated, her voice trembling with a rage she was struggling to contain. "What profile is that exactly?" Brenda's eyes were cold, hard chips of obsidian. "You know what profile." The air crackled. The quiet murmur of the gate area seemed to fade away, focusing into a single intense point at the counter. Zoe felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes a mixture of pity, curiosity, and discomfort. She was no longer a student on her way to an adventure. She was a spectacle. With a sudden deliberate movement that was shockingly violent in its finality, Brenda Jenkins ripped the boarding pass in two. The sound of tearing paper was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. She then ripped the two halves into quarters. She dropped the confetti of Zoe's future onto the counter. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for fraudulent documents," Brenda announced, her voice ringing with a perverse, self-righteous authority. "You're denied boarding. Now please step out of the line before I call security." For a long moment, Zoe could only stare at the 4 white rectangles lying on the grey laminate counter. They were the pieces of her dream. Her name, the flight number, the destination, all fractured. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient noise of the airport returning as a dull, distant roar. Shock, cold and sharp, pierced through the hot flush of her anger. "You can't do that." She finally whispered the words, barely audible. "I just did." Brenda retorted, her arms crossing over her chest in a posture of unassailable authority. "Now I'm not going to ask you again. Step aside. You're holding up the line." Zoe's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She thought of her meticulous packing, the carefully selected sketch pads and charcoal pencils. She thought of the apartment waiting for her near the Piazza della Signoria. She thought of the orientation scheduled for the next evening. Missing this flight wasn't an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Zoe said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a surge of adrenaline. She would not be dismissed. She would not be erased. Brenda rolled her eyes with theatrical exasperation. "Oh, here we go. Fine." She turned and spoke into a small walkie-talkie clipped to her shoulder. "David, I need you at gate F7. Got a situation." While they waited, the line was rerouted to the other agent, who was now working with frantic efficiency, his face a mask of strained neutrality. He avoided looking at Zoe and Brenda, focusing intently on his screen. The passengers shuffled past, some stealing curious glances, others pointedly looking away, eager to distance themselves from the unfolding drama. Zoe felt a profound sense of isolation, as if a glass wall had dropped between her and the rest of the world. She was the problem, the disruption. A man in his late 30s with a slightly rumpled suit and a perpetually worried expression hurried toward the gate. His name tag read, "David Chen, lead agent." "Brenda, what's going on?" he asked, his eyes darting from Brenda's stony face to Zoe's trembling one, and finally to the torn pieces of the boarding pass on the counter. His expression soured. "Oh, for crying out loud, Brenda. What happened? I caught her with a fraudulent ticket." Brenda announced, her voice ringing with conviction. "She got belligerent when I questioned her about it. Said her father bought it for her. She fits the pattern we were warned about in the morning briefing: stolen cards, premium seats." David Chen looked at Zoe, his expression softening slightly. "Ma'am, is this true?" "No," Zoe exclaimed, her voice cracking. "She asked me invasive questions about my father's job. She said I fit a profile. She never even scanned the ticket to see if it was valid. She just ripped it." David sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was caught. On one hand, he had a young woman who seemed genuinely distressed. On the other, he had a veteran employee known for being difficult, but also for her nearly spotless record. Brenda was a stickler for the rules, sometimes to a fault. "Brenda, did you attempt to verify the ticket in the system?" David asked, his tone careful. "The situation escalated too quickly." Brenda lied smoothly. Her hostility was a major red flag. "According to protocol, we are to de-escalate by terminating the interaction and involving security if necessary. I determined that denying boarding was the most direct way to neutralize a potential threat." She used the corporate jargon like a shield, each word a carefully placed brick in the wall of her defense. Zoe stared at her, mesmerized by the audacity of the lies. Neutralize a potential threat. She was a 17-year-old girl with a sketchbook. David turned his attention back to Zoe. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but Brenda is one of our most experienced agents. If she felt there was a credible reason to doubt the document's validity..." He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. He was siding with his employee. It was the path of least resistance. "So you're not even going to check?" Zoe asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "You can just look up my name. Zoe Wilson. The ticket is paid for. It's real. My bag is already on that plane. At this point, that doesn't matter." David said, his voice hardening slightly as he adopted the official tone of someone who has made a final decision. A judgment call was made by the agent at the time of boarding. The final boarding call has been made. I can't hold the plane. I'm sorry. As if on cue, a robotic voice announced, "Final boarding call for Delta Flight 192 to Rome." The other agent began to pull the strap across the entrance to the jet bridge. "No," Zoe pleaded, looking past the agents toward the tunnel that led to the plane. "Please just look it up. It will take you 30 seconds. The decision is final," David said, his voice now firm, brooking no further argument. He gestured for Brenda to begin closing down the gate. "Brenda, shut it down." Brenda moved with smug efficiency, typing commands into her computer. The screen behind her, which had displayed the flight information, went blank. The heavy door to the jet bridge swung shut with a dull metallic thud. A locking mechanism clicked into place with chilling finality. The sound echoed in Zoe's ears. The door wasn't just closed, it was locked. The plane with her luggage, with her seat, with her connection to Florence, was on the other side, about to depart without her. Tears of pure frustration and helplessness welled in Zoe's eyes. She had followed the rules. She had been polite. And for nothing. She had been judged, tried, and sentenced by a single woman in a matter of minutes, and now the system was closing ranks to protect its own. "You're going to have to go back to the ticketing counter downstairs to discuss rebooking options," David said, his tone suggesting he had already moved on. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a flight to dispatch." He turned his back on her. Brenda refused to even look at her, busying herself with paperwork. The torn pieces of the boarding pass still lying on the counter like a casualty of war. Defeated and shaking, Zoe Wilson backed away from the gate. The bustling terminal now felt hostile and alien. She was alone. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. There was only one person she could call. She scrolled to Dad and pressed the button, a single tear tracing a hot path down her cheek. Jack Wilson was in his element. The boardroom on the top floor of the airport's administrative complex was a world away from the chaotic terminals below. Here the air was cool and still, the view a panoramic sweep of runways and taxiways where multi-million-dollar aircraft moved with the slow, deliberate grace of grazing giants. He sat at the head of a massive mahogany table flanked by his senior leadership team, the Director of Operations, Head of Security, Chief Financial Officer, and Anya Sharma, his sharp-as-a-tack Deputy Director. They were in the middle of a tense quarterly review with representatives from the Transportation Security Administration. The topic was efficiency optimization, a corporate euphemism for doing more with less. The new staffing metrics are showing a 12% reduction in overtime payouts, the CFO was saying, pointing to a graph on the large screen. "It's a significant cost-saving measure, Jack." Jack nodded, though a knot of unease tightened in his gut. He had pushed for these new metrics. The pressure from the City Council and the airline consortium to cut costs was immense. But he'd also seen the internal reports from HR. Employee morale was at an all-time low. Sick days were up. Complaints of burnout were rampant. "The savings are undeniable," Jack said, his voice calm and measured. "But Anya, what's the feedback from the floor? What are the unions saying?" Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a fierce intellect, met his gaze. "They're saying their people are being stretched to the breaking point, Jack. They're saying the pressure to meet processing targets is leading to rushed judgments and a decline in customer interaction quality. They're warning that something is going to snap." The word snap hung in the air just as his phone, set to vibrate on the polished table, began to buzz insistently. He glanced at the screen, Zoe. He would never ignore a call from his daughter. He held up a hand, a silent apology, to the TSA officials. "Excuse me for one moment. This is important." He stepped out of the boardroom and into the quiet of his personal office, the panoramic view now his alone. He answered with a smile in his voice. "Hey, sweetie, you should be in the air by now. Did you forget something, Dad?" The sound of her voice instantly dissolved his smile. It was small, broken, and trembling on the verge of a sob. Every parental alarm in his body went off at once. "Zoe, what is it? What's wrong? Are you okay? They wouldn't let me on the plane." She choked out the words, tumbling over each other. "The gate agent. Dad? She said my ticket was fake. She said I fit a profile, and she ripped up my boarding pass in front of everyone." Jack felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a surge of ice-cold fury. He gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could hear the muffled sounds of the terminal behind her, the announcements for other people's flights, other people's journeys continuing while his daughter's had been violently halted. "Where are you, Zoe? Tell me exactly where you are." I'm still near the gate. F7. They just closed the door. The plane is still here. Dad, my bag is on it. Everything. Stay right there, Zoe. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'm coming down." "Dad, what are you—" "I'm coming down now." He repeated his voice, a low, dangerous growl. He rarely used a tone reserved for moments of absolute crisis. He hung up and strode back into the boardroom. The 20 people in the room fell silent, their attention snapping to him. The transformation was startling. The calm, diplomatic executive director was gone. In his place was a man radiating an aura of barely controlled rage. His face was a thundercloud. "Anya," he said, his voice tight. "Come with me. Everyone else, this meeting is over. We'll reschedule." He didn't wait for a response, turning on his heel and heading for the private elevator that connected the executive suite to the lower levels. Anya Sharma, grabbing her tablet, hurried to catch up, her expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Jack, what's happened?" she asked as the elevator doors slid shut. "There was an incident at gate F7. With Zoe," he said, staring at the floor numbers as they descended rapidly. "Zoe, is she hurt? She was racially profiled, publicly humiliated, and denied boarding by a Delta agent who tore up her first-class ticket." "A ticket," he added, his voice dropping another octave, "that I paid for with my black-issued Amex card linked to the salary I earn running this goddamn airport." Anya paled. She was a woman who dealt with bomb threats, security breaches, and diplomatic incidents. But she knew in that moment that none of it would compare to the storm that was about to break over gate F7. "Who was the lead agent on duty?" Jack demanded. Anya was already tapping furiously on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen, pulling up staff rosters and gate assignments. "Gate F7. Lead agent is David Chen. The gate agents are Ken Ogawa and Brenda Jenkins." Jack's jaw tightened. "Get me everything on Brenda Jenkins. Commendations, complaints, service record. Everything. And get the head of Delta's Atlanta station on the phone. Tell him to meet me at the gate 5 minutes ago." The elevator doors opened onto the concourse level, a secure hallway behind the public-facing areas. Jack started walking, not with the brisk stride of an executive, but with the purposeful ground-eating pace of a predator. He was no longer Jack Wilson, executive director, wrestling with budgets and policies. He was a father, and someone had hurt his child in his house. The efficiency metrics, the cost-cutting measures, the union warnings. It all came rushing back to him, not as abstract data points, but as the potential framework for the very snap Anya had warned him about. A snap that had just torn his daughter's world apart. The atmosphere at Gate F7 had settled into a kind of weary, post-crisis quiet. The last passengers for the next flight wouldn't arrive for another hour. David Chen was on his computer filing the incident report, carefully phrasing it to protect both his employee and the airline. He described a non-compliant passenger and a standard denial of boarding due to document verification issues. It was clean corporate and a complete fabrication. Brenda Jenkins was sipping a lukewarm coffee, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. She had successfully defended her territory. She had put a stop to what she was certain was a case of flagrant entitlement, another example of someone getting something they hadn't earned. It was a small victory in a life that felt full of defeats. Zoe stood about 20 feet away, near a charging station, her back against a pillar. She felt numb, adrift in the sea of travelers. She watched the plane, her plane being pushed back from the gate, its massive engines beginning to whine. It was really happening. It was leaving. Then through the crowd she saw him. Her father wasn't running, but he moved with an intensity that parted the crowds before him like a ship's bow through water. He wore the same tailored suit he'd had on that morning, but his face was an iron mask of fury. Flanking him was his deputy Anya Sharma, her eyes scanning the scene, already assessing, analyzing. David Chen looked up from his monitor, annoyed at the disturbance. He saw a well-dressed man approaching with purpose, and his customer service smile clicked on automatically. "Sir, can I help you? The gate for Flight 192 is now closed." Jack Wilson didn't break his stride. He walked directly to the counter, his eyes locking onto Brenda, who was now staring, a vague sense of unease starting to penetrate her self-satisfaction. "Who is the lead agent here?" Jack asked, his voice dangerously quiet. David stepped forward. "I am. David Chen. Is there a problem, sir?" Jack's gaze shifted to him, and for the first time David felt a genuine jolt of fear. He had seen this man before. In newsletters, at airport-wide town halls. It couldn't be. "You have a big problem, Mr. Chen," Jack said, his voice low and cutting. He gestured toward Zoe, who was now slowly walking toward them. "My daughter was scheduled to be on that flight. She was denied boarding." David's face went white. He glanced from Jack to Zoe, the family resemblance suddenly horribly obvious. The world tilted on its axis. Your daughter," he stammered. "Yes, Zoe Wilson," Jack said, his eyes flicking to Brenda. "And you are—" Brenda, still not comprehending the full magnitude of the situation, straightened up. "Brenda Jenkins. I was the agent who handled the situation." "The situation." Jack repeated the words, dripping with scorn. He looked down at the torn pieces of the boarding pass, still sitting on the counter. He picked one up. "My daughter tells me you ripped up her boarding pass. It was a procedural action." Brenda began falling back on her training. "I had reason to believe the document was fraudulent." The passenger became hostile. "Stop talking," Jack commanded. The sheer, unadulterated authority in his voice made Brenda's words die in her throat. "Anya." Anya stepped forward, holding her tablet. "Brenda Jenkins." She read her voice crisp and clear. "Employed with Delta for 19 years. 17 written complaints in the last 2 years, all for rude and aggressive behavior toward passengers. 4 of them specifically cite accusations of racial bias. All were dismissed by local management after a verbal coaching." She glanced at David, a silent indictment that made him feel about an inch tall. David opened his mouth to speak to defend himself, but Jack cut him off. "Mr. Chen, as the lead agent, did you attempt to verify my daughter's ticket when she asked you to—" "Well, Brenda had already made the assessment, and we were at the end of the boarding window. I had to make a call to avoid a delay." David mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. "So you took the word of an employee with a documented history of aggressive behavior over a passenger's plea for a simple computer check?" Jack stated not as a question, but as a verdict. "You chose the path of least resistance to avoid a 2-minute operational delay, and in doing so, you condoned this." He turned his full attention back to Brenda, who was now visibly trembling. The smugness had been replaced by a primal fear. She was looking at the man whose face was on the wall in the employee break room, the man who ran the entire airport. "You looked my 17-year-old daughter in the eye." Jack said, his voice a low, controlled tremor of rage. "And you accused her of fraud. You said she fit a profile. Tell me, Miss Jenkins, what profile is that?" "The young black woman in first-class profile. Is that a new Delta policy I'm unaware of?" Brenda was speechless, her face ashen. "Then you destroyed her travel document. You humiliated her in public. You did this in my airport." He continued, his voice dropping even lower. "You did this in my house." Just then a man in a Delta corporate uniform came rushing up out of breath. "Jack, I got here as fast as I could. What in God's name is going on?" It was Bill Corrigan, Delta's station chief. Jack turned to him. "Bill, your agent, Ms. Jenkins, just accused my daughter of being a criminal and ripped up her ticket. Your lead agent, Mr. Chen, backed her up without question and refused to help. The flight to Rome just left without her." Bill Corrigan looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at Brenda and David, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The career-ending implications were immediately, terrifyingly clear. Jack wasn't finished. He looked past them all at the plane, now taxiing toward the runway. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "This is Wilson. I want you to contact the control tower, immediately. Tell them Delta Flight 192 to Rome is to halt its taxi and return to gate F7. The departure is cancelled. Cite a security issue on the ground." Bill Corrigan's jaw dropped. "Jack, you can't. The logistics, the passengers, the cost. I can." Jack said, his eyes like flint. "And I just did. Your airline created a security issue, Bill, by allowing an agent to profile a passenger and assume criminality without any evidence. Now you're going to fix it. That plane is coming back, and my daughter is going to get on it, after Ms. Jenkins and Mr. Chen have been escorted from this gate. Their airport credentials are to be revoked, immediately." He ended the call and looked at Zoe, his expression of fury melting away, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow. "I am so sorry, sweetie. I'm so sorry this happened to you." Zoe, who had watched the entire scene unfold with a kind of stunned detachment, finally broke. The tears she had been holding back began to flow freely, not just tears of frustration, but tears of relief. She stepped forward and collapsed into her father's arms, the powerful airport director, once again, just her dad. The 24 hours that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. The official story for the unprecedented return of Flight DL-192 was a last-minute crew manifest discrepancy. The 300-plus other passengers were deplaned and put up in hotels, their grumbling muted by the airline's frantic offers of meal vouchers, hotel rooms, and significant travel credits. The cost to Delta was astronomical, but it paled in comparison to the cost of the scandal that Jack Wilson had, for now contained. Zoe was eventually put on the rescheduled flight the next day, her father and a personal envoy from the Delta CEO's office walking her to the plane. She was seated in her original first-class seat, the flight attendants treating her with a kind of reverential deference that made her deeply uncomfortable. The trip was saved, but the joy of it was gone, replaced by a sour, metallic taste of an injustice rectified only by an extreme application of power. Back in Atlanta, the real fallout began. Brenda Jenkins and David Chen were suspended pending termination. The process was swift and brutal. Jack, however, insisted on being part of the internal investigation. He didn't want a simple firing. He wanted to understand the why. This wasn't just about one racist agent. Anya's words about the system snapping echoed in his head. He sat behind a one-way mirror, watching Anya Sharma conduct the exit interview with Brenda Jenkins. It wasn't the furious, self-righteous woman from the gate who sat in the sterile HR office. It was a broken person. Brenda, stripped of her uniform and authority, looked tall and defeated. I'm so tired," Brenda said, her voice raspy. "My mother has Alzheimer's. I'm her sole caregiver. The nursing home costs more than I make. I work 60 hours a week, double shifts, anything I can get. I come in here, and my performance is measured in seconds. How many passengers processed per hour? How fast can you close the door?" She looked up, her eyes pleading with Anya. "And then I see this girl, young, beautiful, not a care in the world, with a $3,000 bag and a first-class ticket. And she's got this look on her face, like she's never known a day of struggle in her life. It's not right. I work myself to the bone just to keep my head above water, and she just gets it all handed to her." "So you decided she didn't deserve it?" Anya asked gently. "I decided it was probably stolen," Brenda corrected, a flicker of her old defensiveness returning. "We get memos all the time. Be on the lookout for..." And she looked just like the pictures they show, the ones they never say out loud, but everyone knows what they mean. She finally broke her shoulders, slumping. "It was wrong. I know it was wrong. I was angry at the world, and I took it out on her. I saw my whole life of struggling, and I saw her life of ease, and I just snapped." Jack listened, his stomach churning. He felt no sympathy for her actions, but a sickening wave of recognition washed over him. The pressure to meet processing targets, rushed judgments. Something is going to snap. These weren't just union talking points. They were the ingredients of the poison that had been administered to his daughter. And he had helped write the recipe. He had pushed the efficiency metrics. He had approved the budgets that kept ground staff salaries stagnant while executive bonuses grew. He saw Brenda not just as a racist employee, but as a casualty of the very system he commanded. A system that squeezed its workforce until the weakest points burst, and the venom of their resentment sprayed onto the most vulnerable targets. Brenda's prejudice was her own, a vile and personal failing, but the airport's high-pressure, low-support environment had provided the perfect incubator for it to flourish into action. Later that evening, he sat in his home office, a glass of untouched bourbon on his desk. The house was too quiet without Zoe's music or the low murmur of the TV from her room. He was looking at a proposal for a new employee wellness and support initiative that Anya had drafted. It was comprehensive, calling for increased mental health resources subsidies for elder and child care, and a complete overhaul of performance metrics to prioritize quality of interaction over speed. It was exactly what was needed. It would also cost millions and fly in the face of the cost-cutting mandate he'd been championing for the last year. His phone buzzed. It was a video call from Florence. He answered to see Zoe's face framed by the window of a sun-drenched Italian apartment. She wasn't smiling. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, sweetheart. You made it. How is it?" "It's beautiful," she said, her voice distant. "I walked by the Duomo today. It was a lot." There was a long pause. "Dad, that woman Brenda. What's going to happen to her?" Jack was taken aback. "She's being fired, Zoe. What she did was inexcusable." "I know," Zoe said, her gaze unwavering through the screen. "It was? But at the gate, before you got there, I really looked at her. She looked tired, like deep in her bones tired. I saw it before she even spoke to me. Is firing her going to fix what made her so angry?" The question coming from his 17-year-old daughter thousands of miles away struck him more profoundly than any presentation from his executive team. She hadn't just seen the injustice done to her. She had seen the humanity, however twisted, in her antagonist. She saw the bigger picture. "No," Jack admitted, his voice quiet. "No, it won't." "You run the whole place, Dad," Zoe continued, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "You can fire her. You can make a plane turn around. You have all this power. Are you going to use it to fix the thing that made her, or are you just going to get rid of her?" In that moment, Jack Wilson felt the full, crushing weight of his responsibility, not just as a father, but as a leader. His daughter hadn't just been the victim of a single act of racism. She had been collateral damage in a systemic failure he had helped to create. Atonement would require more than punishing one employee. It would require him to dismantle a part of the world he himself had built. The decision to change course was for Jack a moral imperative. But in the corporate world, morality is often spelled M-O-N-E-Y. His first major battle was with Delta. While their CEO had been deeply apologetic, the airline's legal and financial teams were balking at the implications. Jack met with Bill Corrigan and a team of stern-faced lawyers from Delta's headquarters. "Jack, we've terminated the employees involved," the lead lawyer, a man named Henderson, said stiffly. "We've compensated your daughter and all affected passengers. As far as we're concerned, the matter is closed." "It's not closed," Jack countered, sliding Anya's proposal across the table. "It's a symptom. Your people are cracking under the pressure. My people are cracking under the pressure. The system we've built, this relentless focus on speed and cost-cutting, is creating more Brendas. This is a cancer, and you don't treat cancer by just removing one tumor." He laid out the plan, a jointly funded airport-wide initiative, a human-first program that would overhaul training to focus on de-escalation and bias recognition, establish a robust employee assistance fund for critical life events, and most controversially, revise performance metrics. Agents would be rewarded for positive passenger feedback and successful problem resolution, not just how many heads they could process per hour. Henderson scoffed. "It's idealistic and unaffordable. We're an airline, not a social work agency." "You're a customer service business," Jack shot back, "and your service is failing. This incident, it was contained. The next one might not be. Imagine if my daughter hadn't been my daughter. Imagine she was just a regular girl who got chewed up and spat out by your system. Imagine she records it. It goes viral. Delta agent's racist tirade. The stock drops 5 points. $1 billion of market cap wiped out. Now tell me my plan is unaffordable." The room went silent. Jack had reframed the argument in the only language they truly understood: risk. The second battle was internal. He presented the new initiative to the airport's board of directors, the same people who had appointed him to trim the budget. He laid out the costs, the millions of dollars in investment for training and support programs. "Jack, we hired you to bring fiscal discipline to Hartsfield-Jackson." One board member, a gruff real estate tycoon, grumbled, "This feels like a step backward." "It's a step toward sustainability." Jack argued, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "We are in the people business. Our employees are our front line. If they are broken, our business is broken. We can absorb the cost of this program. We cannot absorb the cost of a systemic collapse in morale and public trust. This isn't just about preventing lawsuits. It's about defining who we are. Are we a soulless machine that processes human cargo? Or are we a gateway to the world that operates with integrity?" He had Anya present the data, the rising employee attrition rates, the cost of constantly hiring and training new staff, the spike in official complaints. She made the business case, while he made the moral one. It was a potent combination. After a tense 3-hour meeting, the board approved a pilot version of the program, chastened and wary, but convinced. The fallout for the individuals was complex. David Chen was terminated from his lead agent position, but on Jack's recommendation was offered a non-managerial role in the baggage handling department after completing an intensive retraining program. It was a demotion, but not a professional death sentence. For Brenda Jenkins, the path was different. She was fired from Delta, a career of nearly 2 decades erased. But a few days after her dismissal, she received a certified letter. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was from the new Airport Employee Assistance Fund, the very first program Jack had fast-tracked with seed money. The letter informed her that as a recently terminated employee facing a documented family health crisis, she was eligible for 6 months of transitional counseling and a grant to help with her mother's care. There was no forgiveness in the letter. It was an anonymous, systemic act of grace. It was Jack's silent acknowledgement that while her actions were her own, her desperation was a product of the environment he had helped to shape. It was his first act of atonement. Weeks turned into a month. Zoe and Florence began to heal. The initial trauma gave way to a fierce creative energy. Her sketches changed. She still drew the majestic lines of the Ponte Vecchio and the divine face of Michelangelo's David, but she spent more time in the Oltrarno district, the working-class side of the river. She sketched the gnarled hands of the old leather worker, the weary eyes of the woman selling vegetables at the market, the laughter lines on the face of the baker. Her art became infused with a profound empathy, a search for the story behind the face. One afternoon, Jack's phone chimed. It was a photo from Zoe. It wasn't a selfie in front of a famous landmark. It was a picture of her latest work, a large, stunningly detailed charcoal portrait. The subject was a black girl about her own age, with beautiful braids, a designer bag, and a first-class boarding pass held in her hand. But her face was a composite of emotions, hope, excitement, and a deep, world-weary apprehension. In the background, looming just behind her, was the shadow of a tired, angry woman in a uniform. The caption simply read, "Fitting the profile." Jack stared at the image, his heart aching with a mixture of pride and sorrow. His daughter, the artist, had processed her pain and transformed it into a powerful statement. She had found her own way to tell the story, to make sense of the ugly, complicated truth. The ripped boarding pass had nearly destroyed her dream, but the experience in the end was shaping her into the very artist she was meant to become. 6 months later, the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport felt different. The changes were subtle, not things a casual traveler would necessarily notice, but to the thousands of employees who made the city within a city run, they were monumental. The Human First initiative was in full swing. In the employee break rooms, posters advertising processing speed targets had been replaced with information about mental health workshops and subsidized childcare. The Agent of the Month award was no longer given to the fastest scanner, but to someone like Maria, a gate agent at Concourse E, who had spent an hour with a frantic non-English-speaking grandmother using a translation app on her phone to help her find her connecting flight. Jack Wilson was different too. He spent less time in the top-floor boardroom and more time walking the concourses. He wasn't just observing operations, he was talking to people. He knew the names of the skycaps at the international drop-off. He chatted with the janitorial staff on the midnight shift. He would sit for coffee in the employee cafeteria, not as the executive director, but just as Jack, listening to concerns about scheduling software and the quality of the coffee. He was relearning his own airport from the ground up. His relationship with the union leaders had transformed from adversarial to collaborative. They still fought over contract details, but now there was a foundation of mutual respect. He had proven that he saw the employees as assets to be nurtured, not costs to be managed. The entire culture of the airport was slowly, painstakingly beginning to shift. He stood one crisp autumn afternoon at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching a plane lift gracefully into the sky. On his desk, next to the neat piles of reports, was a framed photograph. It was the picture Zoe had sent him of her charcoal drawing fitting the profile. It had won the top prize at the Accademia's summer exhibition. An Italian art critic had praised its unflinching portrayal of the intersection of privilege, prejudice, and the invisible burdens of modern life. Next to the photo was a postcard that had arrived that morning. The front was a picture of the Uffizi Gallery. The back was covered in Zoe's elegant script. Dad Florence was life-changing, not just for the art, but for the perspective. I'm back in the States now, getting ready for college. I've decided to double major fine arts and sociology. It turns out I'm just as interested in the systems that shape people's faces as I am in the faces themselves. I think about that day at the airport a lot. I used to think power was a weapon you use to win a fight. You showed me it can also be a tool you use to rebuild something better after it's been broken. That's a lesson art school could never teach me. See you at Thanksgiving. Love. Zoe. Jack read the words for the 10th time, a lump forming in his throat. He looked from the postcard to the photo, then out at the vast, sprawling airport under his command. He thought of Brenda Jenkins. He had heard through the grapevine of the assistance program that she had completed counseling and found a new job as an administrative assistant at a logistics company far from the airport. Her life wasn't fixed, but perhaps it was no longer in a state of freefall. Her story for him was a permanent reminder of the human cost of a system left unchecked. The incident at Gate F7 had started as a story of a father's power and a daughter's pain. But it had become something more. It had been a painful, costly, and deeply personal catalyst for change. It had ripped apart the comfortable veil of his own success and forced him to confront the flaws in the world he had helped build. He had nearly lost his daughter's dream, but in the process he had found a new purpose. He wasn't just running an airport anymore. He was trying to build a more humane one. One gate, one employee, one passenger at a time. The work was far from over, but it was a new beginning. The story of Zoe and Jack Wilson is more than just a viral moment waiting to happen. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly a dream can be shattered by prejudice, but also how a moment of crisis can become a catalyst for profound change. It shows us that behind every act of bias, there is often a story of a broken system and people pushed to their breaking point. This wasn't just about a father saving his daughter. It was about a leader forced to confront the flaws of his own creation and choosing the difficult path of atonement over the easy path of punishment. What happened at Gate F7 could happen anywhere. It speaks to the hidden struggles and snap judgments that shape our daily lives. Have you ever felt judged or misunderstood? Have you witnessed an injustice and wished someone in Wu would step in? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story matters. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more real-life dramas that make us think. Thank you for watching.